In a federal storage room in Washington, long after midnight, clerks once stood among towers of paper that no longer exist. Shelves bent under the weight of schedules, ledgers, population tallies, handwritten names, occupations, ages, birthplaces, illnesses, debts, marriages, widows, laborers, farmers, boarders, drifters, children, and the dead. The 1890 census was more than a count. It was a snapshot of an entire nation at the moment it crossed into modernity. It captured Americans just before the closing of the frontier, just before the giant consolidations of the new century, just before the country's memory began to harden into official history. And then, somehow, most of it disappeared. The standard explanation is simple. Parts of the 1890 census were damaged. Later, more of it was destroyed. Neglect, fire, bureaucracy, indifference. A tragedy of archives. A sad accident. But the more closely you look, the less accidental it feels. Because the 1890 census was not just another stack of records. It was the one national document that could have shown in intimate human detail who America was before the great administrative tightening of the 20th century. It was the bridge between two worlds, the local and the centralized, the remembered and the standardized, the family known by neighbors and the citizen reduced to a file. If you wanted to blur that bridge, if you wanted later generations to live with uncertainty about who had been where, when, and under what conditions, there was hardly a more efficient place to begin. The 1890 census officially was lost, but what if it was something else? What if it was erased? To understand why that question matters, you have to begin with what a census really is. Not in the abstract, not in the dry language of federal administration, but in its human form. A census is a vast act of naming. It tells a government who exists, where they live, how they work, who depends on whom, which children are in which homes, which widows took in boarders, which old men lost farms, which families moved west, which neighborhoods changed names, which counties filled with laborers almost overnight, which towns seemed to rise too quickly or thin out too suddenly. And in 1890, the United States needed that kind of knowledge badly. The country had been transformed by the decades after the Civil War. Railroads stretched across the continent. New cities had boomed into prominence. Immigration patterns had shifted. Industrial labor was reshaping urban life. Western settlement had accelerated. The old rhythms of rural America still existed, but they were being threaded into something bigger, more extractive, more administrative. The federal government wanted numbers. Reformers wanted data. Businesses wanted predictability. Politicians wanted maps of change. The census of 1890 was supposed to provide it all. In fact, it was considered so important that it was conducted with new methods and new ambitions. This was the census famous for its use of tabulating technology associated with Herman Hollerith, whose punched card system marked a turning point in modern data processing. The nation was not just counting itself. It was learning how to machine count itself. That detail matters more than it first appears. The 1890 census stood at the threshold where America began turning people into standardized units of information on an unprecedented scale. And yet, despite all that effort, what should have become one of the foundational records of American demographic memory instead became one of its greatest archival voids. Later historians would explain the loss in fragments. A fire in the Commerce Department building in 1921 damaged many census records. Some were water-soaked, some charred. Others were declared unsalvageable. Additional records were later disposed of under routine authority. What remained of the 1890 population schedules was, for the most part, gone. That is the official story. But official stories have a way of flattening sequences that deserve to be unfolded. Because when you slow the timeline down, several things begin to trouble the neatness of the loss. First, the 1890 census was known to be uniquely valuable even in its own time. It sat at a historical crossroads. It recorded the country just before the 1890 declaration that the American frontier was effectively closed. It captured millions living through the aftershocks of Reconstruction, mass migration, industrial unrest, land speculation, railroad expansion, and the changing architecture of labor. It was not obscure, and it was not skewer, and it was not skewer. Second, The destruction was not a single clean event. There was damage, yes, but there were also decisions, human decisions about preservation, salvage, storage, and disposal. At multiple points, officials judged what could be saved, what was worth saving, and what was not. Records do not simply vanish. They pass through hands. They pass through offices. They pass through categories like damaged, obsolete, unnecessary, disposable. That is where accident begins to shade into policy. And third, the consequences of the loss were unusually deep. Genealogists felt it. Historians felt it. Families felt it. Entire lines of continuity between 1880 and 1900 became harder to trace. People who should have appeared in the ordinary chain of national self-documentation instead seemed to flicker in and out of existence. You could find them in one decade. Then they were gone. Then they reappeared in another state, another household, another spelling, another life. A single missing census does not destroy a nation's memory, but it creates a gap wide enough for confusion, reinvention, and erasure to enter. And that gap matters even more when it falls exactly where identities were already unstable. Think of the America of the 1890s. Children taken in under informal arrangements. Families split by migration. Widows remarrying and changing surnames. Railroad labor moving seasonally. Black families navigating the promises and betrayals of post-Reconstruction America. Immigrant names being shortened, altered, or translated. Western towns forming faster than their records could stabilize. Land claims contested. Addresses shifting as cities rebuilt streets and redrew districts. Now remove one of the most comprehensive snapshots of that fluid population. What disappears is not just paper. What disappears is proof. Proof that a family lived in one place before it did in another. Proof that a child belonged to a household before being renamed. Proof that a laborer was counted before vanishing into a new district. Proof that a widow maintained a residence before property changed hands. Proof that a town's population looked one way before an administrative reorganization made it appear another. In a country increasingly organized by institutions, proof is everything. Which is why the 1890 census gap has always felt larger than archival bad luck. There is something unsettling about its placement in time. Too early to be fully protected by modern archival consciousness. Too early to be genuinely primitive. Old enough to be fragile, but new enough that its destruction should have caused deeper alarm than it did. And yet the record of alarm feels strangely thin. There is regret, yes. There are later laments. But the emotional charge does not seem equal to the scale of the loss. Why? One possibility is obvious. Governments are large, and bureaucracies are careless. Records are neglected because people assume someone else will care for them. Fires happen. Water destroys. Paper crumbles. That is true. Archives are vulnerable. But there is another possibility, more difficult and more troubling. Sometimes records are not actively hated. They are simply inconvenient. Their continued existence complicates future narratives. They preserve patterns that later systems would prefer to simplify. They tether the modern state to an untidy reality full of local names, alternative arrangements, unstable populations, and social facts not easily harmonized with the story of orderly progress. And the 1890 census may have preserved exactly that kind of untidy reality. It would have shown a country between identities. Not the clean America of patriotic myth, nor the fully urban industrial America of the 20th century, but the transitional one in between, the one where local economies still carried older forms of dependence and independence, the one where memory lived closer to households than to institutions, the one where official maps and lived reality did not always match. There is a reason transitional records often become the most dangerous records. They reveal not a stable order, but a conversion. The census was also tied to another revealing phrase from 1890 itself, the idea that the frontier was closed. The declaration, later associated with the census and with Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, carried immense symbolic force. It suggested that the nation had entered a new historical phase. No more endless free land. No more westward release valve. No more open horizon to absorb tension. A population had to be managed differently, now more densely, more administratively, more centrally. That was not merely a geographic shift, it was a psychological one. And if the 1890 census helped certify that transition, then preserving its raw human detail might have mattered very differently to different kinds of people. To historians, it was evidence. To reformers, data. To families, identity. To administrators, a tool. But to any emerging system that preferred standardization over memory, its local granularity may have been more burden than treasure. This is where the human scale of the story returns. Imagine a daughter in 1910 searching for proof of where her father had lived before he died. Imagine a widow in 1925 trying to establish residence, inheritance, or family connection. Imagine a grandchild decades later trying to follow a line between one county and another, one surname and its earlier form. In countless American families, the 1890 census would have been the hinge between the known and the forgotten. When it vanished, what vanished with it was often not history in the grand sense, but continuity in the intimate one. There is something almost cruel about the nature of such a loss. The names were written down. Someone stood at the door. Someone answered the enumerator. Someone said, "Yes, we are here. Yes, this is my wife. Yes, these are our children. Yes, this is how we work, how we live, how old we are, where we were born." For a moment, the nation acknowledged their existence in ink. And then later generations were told, more or less, that the nation misplaced them. Misplaced them. The word itself feels too soft, because the more you look at the aftermath, the less the language of misplacement seems adequate. There were recommendations. There were assessments. There were judgments that certain damaged records need not be preserved. There were disposal procedures. There was, in other words, administration. Erasure in modern states rarely looks like a man with a torch. More often it looks like a committee deciding restoration is not worth the cost. That is what makes archival destruction so powerful. It disguises itself as procedure. And procedure has a way of moralizing indifference. No villain, no headline, just process. Yet process can reshape history as surely as fire. By the early 20th century, America was becoming a country of files, credentials, centralized agencies, and professionally managed knowledge. Identity was increasingly mediated through institutions rather than local recognition. Birth certificates, death certificates, school records, Social Security later on, immigration files, property registers, these systems accumulated authority as memory decentralized. In that world, a missing census did more than inconvenience historians. It weakened one of the last broad bridges between the old nation of face-to-face recognition and the new nation of abstract documentation. It also created a strange permission for future simplifications. When one generation's most comprehensive population record disappears, later narratives gain room to smooth edges. Towns can be remembered differently. Demographic transformations can appear cleaner than they were. Family dispersals can look natural rather than forced. Name changes lose context. Patterns blur. Historical discontinuities grow harder to challenge because the granular evidence that might have complicated them is gone. This does not require a grand hidden master plan. It requires only a convergence of interest between neglect and utility. A record inconvenient to preserve is often a record convenient to lose. That is why the title matters. Not lost. Erased. Because lost implies helplessness. Erased implies agency, even if that agency is dispersed across offices, years, and routine decisions rather than concentrated in one dramatic act. A record can be erased bureaucratically. Erased by underfunding. Erased by neglect, justified as efficiency. Erased by declaring damaged pages beyond recovery when a deeper will to preserve is absent. And if the 1890 census was erased in that sense, then its destruction tells us something larger about the modern American state, that what a nation chooses not to preserve often reveals as much about power as what it proudly archives. There is another haunting layer here. The 1890 census did not disappear alone into some abstract void. It vanished into a period already full of archival fractures, fires, administrative reorganizations, shifting jurisdictions, rebuilt cities, renamed wards, altered streets, buried records, discarded county volumes, and the gradual triumph of official summaries over raw local detail. The census might have been the largest single loss, but it was not the only one. It belongs to a broader pattern in which the documentary foundations of ordinary people's lives often proved less durable than the narratives later built above them. In that sense, the census gap is not merely a genealogical problem. It is a metaphor for American memory itself. A country that recorded intensely, but unevenly. A country obsessed with enumeration, but selective in preservation. A country willing to count people when counting served administration, yet not always willing to guard those counts when their deeper human value emerged later. And still the question lingers, why was there not more urgency to save it? Perhaps because urgency depends on what a society thinks records are for. If records are tools, then once used, they can seem expendable. If records are memory, then their destruction feels like injury. The handling of the 1890 census suggests a state still thinking of itself more in the first way than the second. But if that is true, it is revealing in its own right. It means millions of individual lives were captured for governance, then insufficiently valued for remembrance. There is no need to invent a dramatic secret to feel the weight of that. The tragedy is already large enough. And yet, once you sit with it long enough, tragedy begins to shade into suspicion, not because suspicion is fashionable, but because the pattern of consequence is too great for easy comfort. A nation's most important transitional census is damaged, then discarded in vast part, then mourned almost as an inevitability. Families are left with gaps. Historians are left with summaries in place of people. The bridge between 8080 and 1900 weakens at exactly the moment when America was becoming something new. That is more than unfortunate. It is formative. Maybe the 1890 census was not erased to hide one single thing. Maybe it was erased because it contained too many difficult things at once. Unstable names, unstable addresses, unstable communities, unstable truths about how fast and unevenly the country was changing. Maybe no one needed to order its destruction in the theatrical sense. Maybe it was enough that preserving it did not serve the same interests as letting it fade. History often turns on that quieter form of power, not what must be openly forbidden, but what simply fails to find a defender. So the census disappeared. Not entirely, not instantly, but enough. Enough that the phrase became familiar. The lost 1890 census. Generations repeated it. Genealogists sighed over it. Archivists noted it. Historians worked around it. The gap became normal. But normal is not the same as harmless. The longer an absence endures, the more invisible its effects become. People stop asking what might have been provable. They stop noticing how many stories break there. The silence becomes part of the architecture. That may be the deepest loss of all. Not the burned schedules, but the habit of accepting the void they left behind. Because once a society gets used to missing records at crucial moments, it also gets used to living with uncertainty about itself. Somewhere in that uncertainty are millions of vanished introductions, names spoken once to an enumerator and then scattered, households that existed in ink and then in nothing, children accounted for, then obscured, workers counted, then abstracted, places stabilized for a moment and then released back into ambiguity. And so the 1890 census remains one of those strange American ruins made not of stone, but of absence. A missing foundation beneath later histories. A place where the floor drops out and the narrative keeps walking as if nothing happened. But something did happen. A record that should have anchored memory did not survive the modern system it helped inaugurate. And if you look carefully at that contradiction, it begins to feel less like accident than revelation. Revelation of what a nation values when memory becomes expensive. Revelation of what happens when administration outruns conscience. Revelation that erasure does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it arrives in forms, inventories, recommendations, disposal lists, and regretful language written after the fact. The 1890 census was not merely lost in the way a key is lost or a box misplaced in transit. It passed through hands, decisions, categories, and permissions until the outcome became irreversible. That is not clumsiness alone. That is history being thinned by process. So perhaps the real question is not whether every page could have been saved. Perhaps the real question is why so few people acted as if they had to be. And that question does not belong only to the past. It belongs to every generation that inherits a broken archive and must decide whether missing records are just inconveniences or warnings. Warnings that what is not preserved can be as political as what is proclaimed. Warnings that ordinary people are often counted more carefully than they are remembered. Warnings that a nation can lose track of itself, not all at once, but precisely where the evidence should have been strongest. The 1890 census is gone, mostly. The names do not return because we want them to. The schedules do not reassemble themselves, but the gap still speaks. It speaks through family trees that break without explanation, through towns whose demographic story grows strangely foggy at the decade line, through the uneasy sense that a country so committed to record-keeping should not have let this particular record disappear so easily. If you listen carefully, the silence has a shape, and in that shape is the possibility that the census was never simply misplaced by history, but removed by the logic of a system that needed data in the present more than it valued memory in the future, which is another way of saying that the 1890 census may tell us most clearly who America was by showing us what America allowed itself to forget, not by chance, by decision, by process, by erasure. And once you begin to see it that way, the missing pages stop feeling empty. They begin to feel charged, almost luminous in their absence, like outlines left on a wall after something important has been taken away. Perhaps that is where this story truly lives, now not in the records we have, but in the break between them. In the place where continuity should have held and did not. In the uneasy recognition that history is sometimes shaped less by what survives than by what disappears at exactly the wrong moment. The census was meant to tell the nation who it was. Its destruction may tell us even more.